Hi, I'm Stephanie Sebbing. Welcome to the Quilt Addicts Anonymous Block of the Month series. For the March tutorial, we're not actually making a block. We're doing a tutorial on how to put the center together and then how to properly measure for borders so that they're not wavy or too tight, because we've all had those happen and long armers are not very happy when we turn quilts in with that. So we'll go over how to properly measure for a border. But first, let's go over how to put the quilt together. I've already got the first 3 rows together, and for this one I'm putting it together one entire row at a time, and I'm pressing them in opposite directions. So for this row I pressed it toward this end of the block. So for this next row, the top row I'm putting together, I'm going to press it towards the opposite side, so that way at least at these seams I'm going to have a nice even join and good points. So the easiest way to do this is just to flip the blocks one on top of the other, and then we're going to pin. And when we're pinning these, we're going to pin them in a couple of places. I always start with my corners, line those up. Line these 2 corners up here. And if there are any seams that are going to match up, there are not in this block, you'll want to pay particular attention to those. Even though we try to press everything so that it's going in opposite directions, we're never going to be perfect. There's going to be some that are going to overlap. So just pay particular attention when you're pinning those, so that way you're going to be happy with how your points turn out. But I've got a pin here in the middle, and then I'm going to put a pin on the sort of quarter mark of the block as well. And you'll do the same thing for the other one, and then we're just going to sew right down with a 1/4 inch seam. And when I sew, I'm paying particular attention to where these seams are coming together. You can see that my thread line is coming together and crossing. So I want my needle to be right where that point is, and that will ensure that I have a nice, good point when I put everything together. I also should have mentioned at the beginning of this video that we're going to cut 4 12.5-inch squares that are going to form the outside corners of our medallion. And so that's what this is here. For full instructions and assembly diagram, make sure you go to quiltaddictsanonymous.com and click on the Block of the Month tab. And if you go to March, then you can get to the PDF download for the written instructions on how to do this. So I've got my 2 halves of my block, or my row together, my top row. And I want to show you how I'm going to join these 2, because we've got seams going in the same direction. So first step is just to lay them right sides together. All right. Now if you come close, you can see that these 2 seams are going in the same direction. And so that's going to present a unique challenge in getting those points to come together correctly. So what I've done is I've lined them up as best I can, just eyeballing it. And then I'm going to put a pin right in there, and it's going to be a little bit of a thick seam, and that's all right. And so you can just do the best you can, and if you have to redo it, if you're not satisfied with it, then that's all right. Don't worry too much about getting that perfectly the first time. But then I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to repin my corners, my center again, and then my quarter marks. And then I'm going to sew that with a 1/4 inch seam. And just be real careful when you get to this seam that you don't take this pin out until your needle is right on where the seam line is, and that'll help keep everything in line. Okay. So I've got my top row sewn together, and I've got my points coming together, and I'm pretty happy with the way that these joins came out. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next step. So what I've done here is I have all these seams on this row going to my left, to your right, and all the seams on the row before it going to my right and your left. And so that way when I join these 2 rows together, I at least know that these points are going to come out pretty easily without too much fuss. So you just want to lay them right sides together, and then I like to start in the center and work out. So I'm just going to go ahead and put those together. And I like to just slide my seams together until I feel them lock in place. And that's how I know they're going to be right where they need to be. And when you feel this, you shouldn't feel a bump or a gap. It should just feel nice and flat. And that means that you have the seam in the right spot. So I'm going to put this pin in, And I'm going to put it in right in this seam allowance, right where these points come together. Because it really doesn't matter if I'm in line here or out here. What matters is right where those points are, because that's where your eye is going to be drawn. And then you want to do the same thing at all the other block joins. And then go ahead and pin in the center and the quarters of those blocks. And in some cases, like in this one, I've got 2 seams that are going to join up in the center of these blocks. So I want to make sure that those seams are butting up nicely against each other as well when I'm pinning those. So just take your time at this step, and it will lead to much more accurate piecing, and you'll be much happier with where all your points end up. Once you have your entire center sewed together, it's time to measure for the borders. And even though we may sew a perfect 1/4 inch seam, and we may have cut perfectly and everything may have gone together very smoothly, that doesn't mean that mathematically speaking your quilt is going to turn out the exact size that the pattern calls for. Everything from the humidity to the thread you use to the thickness of your fabric will make a difference on how wide your quilt actually is in the end. So what you want to do when you're figuring out your borders to make sure that they're not either too short or too long is you want to measure in the middle and the sides. And I've got a tape measure out for this. Now mathematically, if everything was perfect, this quilt would measure 48.5 inches wide. But I'm actually measuring at 48 and 5/8 for the center. And so now we have to measure the edge. And what you're going to do once you've taken all these measurements is you're going to take the average of the 3. And that is the amount you're going to cut your borders to. So this one is right on 48.5. So we're right there for that one. Now we're going to measure the end, the other end. And this one is just a hair over 48.25. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the average of that, and I'm going to do some math, and I'm not good enough to do it in my head, so I'm going to do it off camera. And that's what I'm going to cut my borders to measure to. Even though the pattern says 48.5, that's not what this number is going to end up being. And that will help ensure that your borders aren't either too tight or too wavy, and that makes for a nice flat quilt and a very happy long arm quilter. So I prepared my border to be the average width of between my ends and my center. And I had to piece mine, which actually works out quite nicely because then I can match up my centers exactly, because I've got a seam line here and a seam line in my border. So again, I'm going to make those seams butt up nicely there. And again, I shouldn't feel a gap or a bump there. I should just feel a nice smooth transition between the 2 seams. And I'm putting my pin in, sorry, it's a little hard to pin upside down here. Putting my pin in right next to where that seam line is. So I'm going to be sewing down here. I'll get my needle to stop right in this half of the seam allowance, then I'll remove this pin and keep going. Now the other places I want to pin, of course I want to pin on my end, down here with my corners together. And then you want to pin at your 1/4 marks as well. So it's good to mark where that is. In this case, I can easily tell where it is because I've got some, it's just laying nice and flat here. But you want to, I know the temptation is really easy to just sew and cut it off when you get to the end. But that is really not great to do. It's much better to sew to fit exactly your width, because then when you get it on the long arm you won't have a wavy border, it won't be too tight, and this really ends up for a much better finished product. So for all the cutting instructions and the widths and everything that you need for this, make sure you go to quiltaddictsanonymous.com and click on the Block of the Month tab and go to March, and that's where you can get the PDF for this month's instructions for how to get your top together, and then some more information on how to properly measure your borders and attach them. So go ahead and do this for all 4 borders. Do your top and bottom first, and then go ahead and do your sides.